Welcome to Module 3. We're now going deep into the first phase of the ADM cycle, Phase A, Architecture Vision. If the preliminary phase is about getting the organization ready to do architecture at all, Phase A is about kicking off one specific cycle of work, setting its scope, painting the aspirational picture, and getting formal approval to proceed. It's a phase the exam loves, particularly around what triggers it and what it produces. Let's see exactly how a cycle of architecture gets started. Here's what you'll take away from this module. You'll know the two objectives of Phase A. You'll be able to clearly distinguish the request for architecture work, the trigger that comes in, from the statement of architecture work, the document that goes out and gets approved. You'll walk through all 11 steps of the phase. You'll understand the architecture vision itself, the stakeholder map, and the business scenarios technique used to discover requirements. And you'll grasp business transformation readiness and the two levels of risk, initial and residual. These last two distinctions are reliable exam points, so we'll give them real attention. Let's place Phase A precisely. It's the first phase of an architecture development cycle, coming right after the one-time preliminary phase. Its job is to take a request for architecture work and turn it into an approved statement of architecture work. Along the way, it sets the scope, the vision, the stakeholders, and the constraints for this particular cycle of the ADM. And it feeds directly into Phase B, where the business architecture work begins. Here's a distinction worth nailing down now: the preliminary phase is one-time setup for your whole architecture capability, whereas Phase A begins each and every cycle. Don't let the exam blur those two together. Phase A has exactly two objectives, and they're worth memorizing word for word in spirit. The first is to develop a high-level, aspirational vision of the capabilities and business value that the proposed architecture will deliver. The second is to obtain approval for a statement of architecture work, the document that defines the program of work to actually develop and deploy that architecture. So, two objectives: first the vision, and second the approved statement of architecture work. Notice how cleanly they map onto the phase's name and its endpoint. You envision, then you get the mandate to proceed. Let's look at what actually kicks Phase A off, the request for architecture work. This is the trigger, the main input that initiates a cycle. It's typically created in the preliminary phase when you first stand things up, or later by architecture change management in Phase H, or directly by sponsoring management who recognize a need. It describes the business need, the drivers behind it, and the mandate to begin architecture work. Now here's the single most common confusion the exam exploits, so let's preempt it. The request for architecture work is the input that starts Phase A. Do not mix it up with the statement of architecture work, which is the output. Request comes in, statement goes out. Beyond the trigger, Phase A draws on several inputs, and they fall into two groups. The non-architectural inputs are the request for architecture work itself, plus the business principles, goals, and drivers. The architectural inputs are three things that mostly come out of the preliminary phase: the organizational model for enterprise architecture, which covers scope, roles, budget, and governance; the tailored architecture framework, which is your customized method, content, principles, and tools; and the populated architecture repository, holding existing baselines, building blocks, and reference materials. The pattern to notice is that Phase A leans directly on what the preliminary phase set up: the tailored framework, the org model, and the repository. Phase A has 11 steps, and while you don't need to recite them in perfect order, you should recognize them. 1. Establish the architecture project. 2. Identify stakeholders, concerns, and business requirements. 3. Confirm and elaborate the business goals, drivers, and constraints. 4. Evaluate capabilities. 5. Assess readiness for business transformation. 6. Define scope. 7. Confirm and elaborate the architecture principles. 8. Develop the architecture vision. 9. Define the target value propositions and KPIs. 10. Identify business transformation risks and mitigation. And 11. Develop the statement of architecture work and secure approval. Importantly, the order is adaptable to your situation under governance, but always remember that the phase ends, at step 11, by securing formal approval. Step 1. Establish the architecture project. The key idea here is that enterprise architecture is itself a business capability, and each cycle of the ADM should normally be run as a project, using whatever project management framework the enterprise already uses. Sometimes the architecture work is a standalone project, other times it's a subset of activities within a larger project. Either way, you secure recognition for the project, get executive endorsement, and line up the support of the necessary line management. You also relate it to other management frameworks in play like Prince2. The exam point: each ADM cycle is handled using the enterprise's project management framework. Step 2 is all about people. You identify the key stakeholders, their concerns and objectives, and the key business requirements the engagement must address. The major product of this step is the stakeholder map, a clear picture of who's involved, how involved they are, and what they care about. And this map isn't just paperwork, it does real work later. It drives which viewpoints you'll need to develop, and it shapes how you present and communicate the architecture to each audience. So whenever you see a question about identifying stakeholders and concerns in Phase A, the answer usually centers on the stakeholder map, which in turn feeds the views and viewpoints you'll build down the line. Step 3. Confirm and elaborate the business goals, the business drivers, and the constraints. Notice the verbs carefully: confirm and elaborate. These goals and drivers usually already exist in the organization's business strategy and plans. The architect's job is to refine and sharpen them for the architecture work, not to invent business strategy from scratch. This anchors the whole vision in genuine business intent rather than the architect's personal preferences. It's a subtle but testable point. In Phase A, architects confirm and elaborate existing business goals, they don't author the company's strategy. Step 4 is to evaluate capabilities. Here you assess what the enterprise can actually do today, and compare that against what the vision will require of it. This produces a deliverable called the capability assessment, which looks at business capability, IT capability, and the maturity of the architecture capability itself. The real value is that it exposes the gap between current capability and the target, telling you honestly whether the organization can pull off what the vision describes. So remember, the capability assessment is a Phase A output that describes both the baseline and target capability, and the distance between them. Step 5, closely related, is the business transformation readiness assessment. Evaluating capability tells you whether the organization can do it. Readiness tells you whether it's actually ready and willing to go through the change the vision implies. You assess a set of readiness factors, things like vision, desire, need, a clear business case, funding, sponsorship, governance, and skills. The point of doing this early is to surface the soft, organizational risks up front, while there's still time to mitigate them in the plan. So in short, the business transformation readiness assessment gauges the organization's ability and willingness to change, and weak readiness is a risk you want to spot now, not later. Step 6 is to define scope, and this is where the 4 scoping dimensions from Module 2 come back into play. You fix the breadth, how much of the enterprise this cycle covers, the depth, the level of detail, the time period, the time frame and any transition points, and the architecture domains, which of business, data, application, and technology are actually in scope. You also identify which existing assets you'll reuse from the repository. There's nothing new to memorize here, it's the same 4 dimensions, applied concretely to this specific cycle. Scope discipline now prevents runaway effort later. Step 7. Confirm and elaborate the architecture principles, including any business principles. Again, note the verbs. The principles themselves were first defined back in the preliminary phase. In Phase A you confirm they still apply, and you elaborate them for this engagement. These principles then guide every later decision and trade-off you'll make through Phases B, C, and D. And they have to align with the broader enterprise principles sitting above them. The clean exam distinction is this: architecture principles are defined in the preliminary phase, and confirmed or elaborated in Phase A. Definition versus confirmation, 2 different phases. Step 8 is the heart of the phase, developing the architecture vision itself. Here you create a high-level view of both the baseline and the target architectures, spanning business, information systems, and technology. A common and very practical way to express it is the solution concept diagram, shown on screen, a concise picture of the major components of the solution and how it'll benefit the enterprise. Think of it as the architecture's elevator pitch. Crucially, the vision covers the full breadth of scope but only at a high level. It's aspirational, not detailed. The detail comes later. So when a question describes a high-level sketch of the target solution, that's your solution concept diagram, and it lives in phase A. Let's highlight a specific technique that powers the vision: business scenarios. A business scenario is a method for discovering and documenting business requirements, and then articulating a vision that genuinely responds to them. A complete business scenario captures several things: the problem you're solving, the environment it sits in, the desired outcome, the human and computer actors involved, and the roles they play. And it's not limited to phase A. The same technique can be reused at more detailed levels, for instance in phase B. The exam framing is simple. Business scenarios are a requirements discovery technique, used first in phase A to ground the vision in real needs. Step 9 makes the vision fundable and measurable. Here you develop the business case and craft a value proposition for each stakeholder grouping, because different stakeholders value different things. You define the KPIs and performance metrics that will be built right into the architecture, so success can be tracked objectively. You assess procurement requirements and the business risk. And critically, you feed all of this into the statement of architecture work, so performance can be monitored throughout the cycle. The headline idea, value propositions plus KPIs, are what turn an inspiring but vague vision into something measurable that sponsors will actually fund. Step 10 is risk, and this contains one of the most reliably tested distinctions in the whole exam. You identify the risks tied to the vision, assess each one's initial level of risk, and assign a mitigation strategy. And there are two distinct levels of risk to track. The initial level of risk is the categorization before you apply any mitigating actions. The residual level of risk is the categorization after mitigation. As the comparison on screen shows, you assess, you mitigate, then you reassess. Risk itself is categorized by impact: catastrophic, critical, marginal, or negligible, and by frequency. Lock this in firmly: initial means before mitigation, residual means after. The exam will absolutely try to flip those two on you. Step 11 brings the phase to its conclusion, developing the statement of architecture work and securing its approval. This document defines the entire program of work for the cycle: the scope, the roadmap, the schedule, the resources, the performance metrics, and the communications plan. It's then reviewed, agreed with the sponsors, and formally approved under governance, and that approval is what actually authorizes the cycle to proceed. The cleanest way to think about it is as the contract to perform this ADM cycle. For the exam, the statement of architecture work is the approved output of phase A, and it authorizes the architecture work that follows. One specific component of the statement of architecture work deserves its own mention: the communications plan. This defines where, how, and when the architects will communicate with stakeholders about the progress of the work. It targets the various affinity groupings and communities of stakeholders you mapped earlier, making sure each gets the right information at the right time. Its whole purpose is to keep stakeholders engaged and informed throughout the cycle, so the architecture doesn't drift away from the people it's meant to serve. Remember that the communications plan is developed in phase A, bundled into the statement of architecture work. Let's gather up everything phase A produces. You get the approved statement of architecture work. You get refined business principles, goals, and drivers. You get the confirmed architecture principles. You get the capability assessment. You get an updated tailored architecture framework. You get the architecture vision itself, which includes a draft architecture definition document with high-level baseline and target sketches. You get the communications plan. And you get additions to the architecture repository. That's a long list, but if you remember just the two headline outputs, the architecture vision and the approved statement of architecture work, you'll have the most tested ones covered. Let's hammer home the distinction that catches the most people, side by side. The request for architecture work is an input. It's the document that triggers the cycle, flowing into phase A. The statement of architecture work is an output. It defines and authorizes the cycle, and it comes out of phase A once approved. So, request equals trigger, coming in, statement equals authorization, going out. If you internalize just this one table, you'll bank the marks on what is genuinely one of the exam's favorite question patterns. Request in, statement out. Let's defuse the phase A traps. 1. Phase A creates a detailed architecture. No, it's a high-level, aspirational vision. 2. The request for architecture work is an output. No, it's the input and trigger. 3. Architecture principles are first defined in phase A. No, they're defined in the preliminary phase and merely confirmed in A. 4. Residual risk is before mitigation. No, residual is after, initial is before. And 5. Phase A produces the implementation plan. No, that's phase F. Keep an especially close eye on the request versus statement and the initial versus residual risk distinctions. Those two appear constantly. Here's your phase A cheat sheet. 2 objectives. 11 steps. The trigger and input is the request for architecture work. The headline output is the architecture vision plus the approved statement of architecture work. The requirements discovery technique is business scenarios. The vision is often drawn as a solution concept diagram. There are 2 risk levels, initial and residual, and risk impact is categorized as catastrophic, critical, marginal, or negligible. And the capability output is the capability assessment. Capture this slide, it covers nearly every recall question phase A can throw at you. Before we summarize, let's see how phase A hands off. The approved scope and vision act as constraints on phases B, C, and D. They keep the detailed work bounded and aligned. The architecture requirements identified here flow into requirements management, that process at the center of the cycle. And the high-level baseline and target sketches you produced get progressively refined, domain by domain, in the phases that follow. The key mindset, phase A is deliberately high-level. It's not where the detail lives, its job is to point the way and authorize the journey. The detail is added next. Let's recap phase A. It starts each ADM cycle, taking a request for architecture work and turning it into an approved statement of architecture work. Its 2 objectives are a high-level vision and approval to proceed. Along the way it produces the stakeholder map, the capability assessment, the architecture vision, value propositions and KPIs, a risk assessment, and the communications plan. Business scenarios discover the requirements, and the solution concept diagram sketches the target. And risk is assessed at 2 levels, initial, before mitigation, and residual, after. That's phase A, vision set, scope fixed, mandate secured. So where to next? With the vision approved, the cycle moves into the architecture domain phases, phase B for business, phase C for data and application, and phase D for technology. And here's some good news that'll make Module 4 much easier. These 3 phases all share a common structure. Each one follows the same rhythm: describe the baseline, describe the target, perform a gap analysis, and define candidate roadmap components. Learn that pattern once in the next module, and you can apply it 3 times over. Let's go meet the domain phases. Question 1. Which document triggers phase A, and which document does phase A produce and get approved? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is B. It is triggered by the request for architecture work and produces the approved statement of architecture work. Phase A is triggered by the request for architecture work, the input, and produces the statement of architecture work, which is then formally approved to authorize the cycle. Request in, statement out. Question 2. What is the difference between the initial level of risk and the residual level of risk in phase A? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is C. Initial risk is before mitigating actions, residual risk is after mitigating actions. Initial level of risk is the categorization before any mitigating actions, residual level of risk is the categorization after mitigations have been applied. Both are assessed by impact, catastrophic/critical/marginal/negligible, and frequency. Question 3. Which technique is used in phase A to discover and document business requirements and articulate a vision that responds to them? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is B. Business scenarios. Business scenarios are the recommended technique for discovering and documenting business requirements in Phase A, and they can be reused at more detailed levels, such as Phase B. Gap analysis happens in the domain phases, the others belong to later phases. Question 4. What is the primary product of identifying stakeholders and their concerns in Phase A? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is B. A stakeholder map showing involvement and concerns. Identifying stakeholders, concerns, and business requirements produces a stakeholder map showing who is involved, their level of involvement, and their key concerns. This map then drives the selection of relevant viewpoints and how the architecture is communicated. Question 5. Which statement best describes the architecture vision produced in Phase A? Pause to consider your answer. The correct answer is B. A high-level, aspirational view of the capabilities and business value to be delivered. The architecture vision is a high-level, aspirational view of the target capabilities and business value, deliberately not detailed. The detailed, domain-level work happens later in phases B, C, and D. The architecture contract belongs to Phase G.